12-year-old Franz Stigler sprinted through a Bavarian pasture in the summer of 1927, chasing a wooden glider he had helped build with his brother August and a group of local boys. The craft was a skeletal framework of wood, wire, and fabric, built from blueprints purchased with scrap metal money under the guidance of Franz's father and a Catholic priest named Father Joseph. When Franz took his place in the glider's wicker seat for his first flight, the launch rope pulled him skyward too fast, and he froze at the controls. The glider nosedived into the earth, burying its nose in the dirt with Franz strapped inside. His father and brother pulled him from the wreckage unhurt, but the glider was damaged. Franz's father inspected the boys' repair work on the wing ribs and found excess glue piled along the seams. Franz argued that the fabric would cover it, but his father replied with a lesson that would echo through the years: always do the right thing, even if no one sees it. 13 years later, in October of 1940, Franz Stigler was working as a flight instructor in Dresden when Father Joseph appeared at his classroom door with tears in his eyes. He told Franz that his older brother August, now a bomber pilot flying Ju-88s against England, had been killed in a crash during a night takeoff. Franz had trained August himself, and the loss filled him with grief and a thirst for revenge. He resigned his instructor post and requested transfer to fighter school, choosing the path of combat. The lesson from the glider field remained buried in his memory, but the war was about to test whether it could survive. The year was 1942. Stigler arrived at Martuba Airfield in Libya, a sprawling tent city baking under the desert sun. He had come a long way from the Bavarian glider fields of his youth. His new squadron leader, Gustav Rodel, met him on the flight line and delivered a warning that would shape his entire war. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute," Rodel said, "I will shoot you down myself." The lesson was simple: fight by rules to keep your humanity. Days later, Rodel took Stigler on his first combat sortie, a free hunt over the desert. They spotted Curtiss P-40s below and dove to attack. Stigler froze as tracers whipped past his canopy, his cannon fire wild and blind. He panicked, hauled back on the stick, and climbed away from the enemy, abandoning his leader. By the time he found Rodel again and limped back to Martuba, Stigler realized he had wet his pants in terror. He expected a lashing, but Rodel only grinned and told him he would never be that scared again for the rest of his life. That evening in the mess tent, when Rodel announced the meal was over and the other pilots stood to leave, he added a quiet exception so Stigler could finish his plate. The small gesture broke the ice. Stigler knew he had survived his trial by fire, and the squadron had accepted him. He flew with new confidence after that, learning to trust his instincts and shoot from close range as the aces taught. The revenge he had sought since his brother's death was still distant, but he was no longer a rookie. By August 1942, the war in Africa had reached a brutal stalemate. Stigler and his comrades lived in holes hacked into the earth, tormented by flies, heat, and sandstorms. Amid this misery, a new leader emerged for Squadron 4, Ferdinand Vogel. He formed a tight inner circle known as the Vold Flight, and soon began inflating victory claims with his wingman Karl-Heinz Bendert. A seasoned pilot named Erwin Swalish arrived from the Eastern Front and joined their flights, but he quickly grew troubled by what he saw. Swalish was an honest professional, a veteran who had fought in Spain, and he confided in Stigler that Vold and Bendert were claiming victories no one had witnessed. Stigler listened, but neither man knew how to stop the deception. The tension built for weeks until a rival squadron leader reported seeing the Vogue flight firing their guns into the sand during mock dogfights pretending to fight. An investigation threatened to strip them of all victories and bring a court-martial. On the morning of August 19, 1942, Swalish told Stigler that no matter the outcome, he would always consider him the best of comrades. Then he took a fighter up for what he called a maintenance flight. Erwin Swalish never came back, his body washed ashore the next day. He had flown his Bf-109 into the sea, choosing suicide rather than live to see his honor stripped by a scandal he had not created. Stigler was devastated. He had promised Swalish he would clear their names, but it was too late. By mid-1943, the Desert War was lost. Stigler and his comrades had withdrawn to Sicily, where a new enemy filled the skies, American four-engine bombers. In June, a rescue mission to save a downed Italian seaplane near Pantelleria turned into a slaughter. 16 American P-40s ambushed the formation. Stigler's Bf-109 was riddled with bullets, his canopy shattered, his face bleeding from a grazing trace around. The engine seized over the sea, and he had to set the dying fighter down on the water. The fighter slammed into the waves and immediately began to sink. Water poured in through the holes in the cockpit. Stigler struggled to release his canopy, but the pressure held it shut. The dark sea climbed to his chin before he pulled the side window and equalized the pressure. He kicked free, inflated his life preserver, and clawed to the surface, gasping for air. From his raft, he watched the Sicilian coast approach as a local fisherman hauled him aboard. His mother's rosary still wet in his pocket. The Pantelleria mission cost the squadron 12 aircraft and most of the rescue pilots. Stigler had survived his second bailout and his first ditching in the sea. By late July 1943, the remnants of Two Group were withdrawn from Sicily and sent home to Germany. He arrived at Wiesbaden Airfield, a clean green base far from the sand and salt of the Mediterranean. Stigler carried 19 victories on his record and a heavy knowledge of what war demanded, the lessons of honor, deception, survival, and loss that would stay with him forever. In September 1943, a young pilot named Charlie Brown completed his B-17 training at Peyote Field, Texas. He was just 20 years old, though. He told everyone he was 24. Brown had grown up on a small farm in West Virginia where he milked cows before school and worked as a janitor at night. Flying had saved him from the infantry, and he never forgot that. At Peyote, he gathered his crew around him, 10 men who would trust him with their lives high over Germany. One evening at the officers' club, Charlie Brown met a woman who changed his quiet world. Marjorie Ketchum was a Wasp ferry pilot, one of the first women to fly military aircraft for the Army. She wore a blue skirt and jacket with gold pins on her collar, paid for from her own salary. The two talked for hours about flying, and Charlie found himself laughing in a way he had not done since leaving West Virginia. She wrote her address on an empty matchbook before she left, and Charlie promised to write. By late October 1943, Charlie Brown and his crew rode a train out of Chicago, heading east to the staging camp at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. The men called themselves the Quiet Ones because they stayed out of trouble while other crews brawled in bars and ran afoul of the military police. But they were ready to fight. They debated their destination as the train rolled east, hoping for the Mediterranean, where the fighting seemed tamer than the skies over Germany. The train carried them through the night toward New York Harbor, where a troop ship waited to cross the Atlantic. Charlie Brown carried Marjorie Ketchum's matchbook in his pocket, along with a photograph of his father back in Weston. He knew his crew was watching him, measuring him, and he resolved to lead them well. They were headed to England to the 8th Air Force, where the bombers went down in flames over Germany. Brown did not yet know that his path and the path of a German fighter pilot named Franz Stigler were already converging. By mid-December 1943, Charlie Brown and his crew had settled into the damp English airfield at RAF Halesworth. They flew their B-17 on practice missions over the North Sea, learning the rhythms of the 8th Air Force. The men still called themselves the Quiet Ones, a name earned by staying out of trouble on base while other crews caroused. But the quiet was about to break. On the morning of December 19th, orders arrived for their first major operation. The target was Bremen, a German port city defended by flak batteries and fighter squadrons. Brown gathered his crew in the drafty Nissen hut that served as their ready room. The men sat on folding chairs, some writing letters home, others shuffling a deck of cards. Brown kept the matchbook with Marjorie Ketchum's address in his jacket pocket, though no letter had yet been written. The navigator, Alfred Sadok, studied his maps in silence. No one spoke much. They all understood that tomorrow would be unlike anything they had faced in training. That evening, the men tried to pass the time with ordinary rituals. The bombardier checked his bombing tables. The gunners cleaned their .50 caliber machine guns by lantern light, the familiar clatter of oiled metal filling the hut. Outside, the English winter fog rolled in, muffling the base in a gray hush. Brown lay on his cot, staring at the corrugated ceiling. He thought of his father back in West Virginia, of the farmhouse with the tin roof. He thought of Marjorie Ketchum and the promise he had made to write. The matchbook sat in his jacket pocket, a small weight against the uncertainty of the hours ahead. Somewhere across the North Sea in the cold German darkness, another pilot was preparing for the same dawn. On the morning of December 19th, Brown and his crew gathered in the base theater for the full briefing. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of bad coffee. A curtain was drawn back to reveal a large map of northern Germany with a red ribbon stretching from England to Bremen. The intelligence officer stood before them, pointer in hand. He told them Bremen was ringed with heavy flak. He told them to expect German fighters, likely Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, rising from fields along the coast. He told them to stay in formation at all costs. Brown took notes on a small pad. Beside him, Sedat calculated fuel burn and drift angles on his knee. The men around them sat in stone silence. This was no longer a drill. The curtain closed and the men filed out for their last checks. Across the gray North Sea at a Luftwaffe airfield near Bremen, a different set of preparations unfolded. Frost covered the wings of the Messerschmitts parked along the runway. Mechanics in oil-stained coveralls ran final engine tests, the sharp crack of Daimler-Benz starters echoing across the field. The fighter pilots gathered in their briefing room, a low concrete bunker heated by a single stove. Among them was a veteran with 19 victories on his rudder, a man who had fought in the deserts of Africa and the skies over Sicily. His name was Franz Stigler. He sat in the back, pipe in hand, listening to the intelligence officer describe the expected bomber stream. The Americans were coming again, this time for Bremen. Stigler pulled the worn rosary from his flight jacket pocket and held it for a moment. Then he returned it to its place over his heart and stood to walk toward his waiting fighter. On the morning of December 20th, the B-17s of the 8th Air Force crossed the German coast at 25,000 feet. Charlie Brown's bomber held its position in the high squadron as the formation droned toward Bremen. Then the flak began, black flowers of steel that hammered the aluminum skin and rattled every rivet. A chunk of shrapnel tore through the nose compartment, wounding the bombardier. Before the crew could react, a swarm of Bf-109s and F-190s struck from the sun. Brown hauled the control yoke left and right, but the fighters came in waves. Cannon shells ripped through the fuselage, shattered the plexiglass nose, and set the number 2 engine on fire. The intercom filled with shouts of wounded men. By the time the fighters broke off, Brown's bomber was a ruin. The tail section was shredded, the rudder cables hanging loose. 2 engines were dead, and the third leaked oil across the cowling. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot, Spencer Luke, who would survive the war and return to Texas, was struggling to keep the wounded plane level. Several gunners were down, their positions torn open to the sky. Brown felt the bitter wind through a hole in the side window and tasted blood from his own nose. The bomber had fallen far behind the main formation, limping eastward at barely 100 knots. Below them lay the gray North Sea, offering no shelter. Franz Stigler spotted the crippled bomber from several miles away. He had just refueled and rearmed after the morning's engagement when his ground crew pointed to the lone B-17 drifting toward the coast. Stigler climbed into his Bf-109 and closed the distance in minutes. As he drew alongside the bomber, he saw the extent of the damage through his gun sight. The fuselage was a sieve of holes. One gunner lay motionless in his waist position. Inside the shattered nose, he could see men hunched over their wounds, too exhausted to man their guns. Stigler had destroyed 3 bombers before, but never had he seen one this broken still flying. He raised his hand to the trigger. Below him, through the torn fuselage, he saw the faces of men who were no longer enemies, just boys like his brother August. He eased off the throttle, pulled alongside the wing, and gestured for the bomber to land. Brown, not trusting the gesture, kept flying east. Stigler made his choice. He pulled up on the bomber's left wing, flying cover, and escorted the wreck for 20 minutes across the open water, past the German flak batteries that held their fire out of confusion. Then he peeled away, dipped his wings once, and vanished into the haze. The B-17 scraped onto the grass at RAF Halesworth on one dead engine and a punctured tire. Medics pulled the wounded gunners from the fuselage and counted the holes, more than 400. Brown filed his after-action report but said nothing about the German pilot who had appeared at his wing. He did not know why the man had let him go. He carried the question quietly for the rest of the war. Stigler, for his part, returned to his unit and told no one what he had done. He flew another year of combat, surviving 2 more bailouts and Germany's collapse in 1945. By then, the war had taken nearly everything from him. Gustav Rodel, the commander who had taught Stigler the code of honor, survived the war and later worked in civil aviation, never forgetting the young pilots he had led through the desert. Alfred Sadok, the navigator who had guided Brown to Bremen and back, survived the war and became a physician in New York, carrying the memory of that flight with him. Father Joseph, the priest who had taught Stigler to fly and think for himself, survived the war and continued his ministry in Bavaria, a quiet witness to the destruction he had foreseen. The suicide of Erwin Swalish, the veteran pilot, who chose death over dishonor, haunted Stigler long after the war ended. In the spring of 1946, Stigler walked the bombed-out streets of Straubing, Germany, looking for work. He wore his old flying boots because they were the only shoes he owned. The townspeople blamed fighter pilots for failing to stop the bombers. One factory manager called him a Nazi and refused him a job. Stigler punched the man and was arrested by German police. He spent that night in a cell, holding his rosary. Eventually, he found work digging ditches and rebuilding rubble. He married, started a family, and emigrated to Canada, where he became a businessman. He never told his wartime story to anyone, not his wife, not his children. He carried the memory of that December morning alone, wondering if the American crew had survived. Charlie Brown returned to West Virginia after the war, went to college on the GI Bill, and built a career with the State Department. He married Marjorie Ketchum, the WASP pilot he had met at Piot Field. The matchbook in his jacket had never been forgotten, but the question of the German pilot stayed with him. In 1986, Brown began searching through German military archives and veterans associations. He placed ads in newsletters asking for any pilot who had flown Bf-109s over Bremen on December 20th, 1943. 4 years of inquiries yielded nothing. Then in January 1990, a letter arrived from Canada. It began, "I was the pilot." Franz Stigler wrote that he had spent 47 years wondering the same thing. When Brown called him in Vancouver, the 2 men talked for hours, filling in the gaps of the only story that mattered to either of them. That summer, Stigler flew to Florida to meet Brown face to face. They embraced at the airport, and Brown later said that it felt like meeting a brother he had never known. The friendship deepened over the following years. They traveled together to air shows, sat on panels, and spoke to audiences about what happened over the North Sea. Stigler would tell the listener that Brown flew like a man who refused to die, and Brown would say that Stigler's act of mercy was the most noble thing he had witnessed in war. They called each other brother and meant it. In 1996, Stigler and Brown co-wrote about their experience for a magazine, giving the story a permanent record. Both men died in 2008, within months of each other. Brown in Miami, Stigler in Vancouver. Their families buried them in separate graves, but their story now belongs to the public record. In a church graveyard in Garmisch, Germany, a headstone stands against the Alps, mounted with a porcelain photograph of a farm boy hugging a cow. That boy was killed in the war. Franz Stigler's own gravestone carries no mention of his victories. He never wanted them counted. What he wanted remembered was the single mission where he chose not to fire. That story remains one of the rarest documents of any war, an act of compassion between sworn enemies, carried out in secrecy, then buried for half a century before being brought into the light. It does not change the arithmetic of the Second World War, but it alters the measure of the men who fought it. The photograph of Stigler as a boy, hugging a cow on a German farm, survived the war and sat on a mantle in Canada. It shows the innocence that the war could not touch and that Stigler later recognized in a shattered bomber over the North Sea. If you have a family story from this era, a memory of a veteran, a letter from a grandfather, or even a photograph that carries a question you have never answered, share it in the comments. We read everyone, and if you believe stories like these deserve a wider audience, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It costs nothing and helps us keep bringing these histories to light. Thank you for listening.